Hello, good night. Welcome to our newest conversation of Let's Talk About Hanford. Tonight's topic is Merrymaking at Hanford. And to cover this, we have invited back our dear friend Robert Franklin from WSU Tri Cities and the Hanford History Project. My name is Ana Alvarez, and I am in the communication section at the Nuclear Waste Program. Just a little bit of background on the Let's Talk About Hanford series. We started these back in 2020 to cover Hanford related topics at a high level. And we will continue doing so for as long as we have interest and participation from the public. On that note, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for being here tonight with us. And now I would like to introduce you to one of our newest members of the communications team, Ben Pruitt.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome, Anna. My name is Ben Pruitt. I use he, him pronouns, and I am one of the two community outreach specialists for Ecology's nuclear waste program. Specifically for my position, I started in early September, and my position focuses mainly on environmental justice related to the Hanford cleanup. Our latest colleague, Sarah Williams, who you may see on a future broadcast, is the other community outreach specialist working with our communications team on many of the exciting activities and events that we have going across the Pacific Northwest. Regarding tonight's presentation, we ask that you please put any questions that you have or comments into either the Zoom chat feature or the Facebook Live chat feature at any time. After our feature presentation, we will have a live question and answer session. You may ask questions throughout the chat, which will be read by one of our hosts at the end of the presentation. If you're not shy, you can ask your question out loud by putting your name in the chat box, kind of just saying, "Hey, I have a question," or raising your hand, and then you'll be called on by one of our hosts. We'll unmute you, and you can ask in person. We encourage questions and comments geared towards tonight's subject, which is about historical holidays at Hanford. But if you have other questions or comments about Hanford, nuclear waste, or ecology, please email hanford@ecy.wa.gov. Back to you, Anna Grissel.
Thank you so much, Ben. At this moment, I will provide just a little bit of background on our returning guest, Robert Franklin. He is the Assistant Director and Archivist of the Hanford Oral History Project and an Assistant Professor of History at Washington State University Tri-Cities. Without further ado, let me welcome back Robert Franklin for tonight's event.
Oh, hello everyone. It's really nice to be back and just to join you again. It's always a pleasure to work with Department of Ecology. Everyone here who I see especially just want to thank everybody who puts these together. Ryan and Diana and a couple of people I haven't met yet, Ben and Sarah, and of course Anna Grissel, who I talk to all the time, or at least monthly. And so it's just really good to be here. Really kind of a fun, different. I can definitely say this is the most time I've ever spent thinking about um, holidays at Hanford, and definitely a different, somewhat more lighthearted take on Hanford history. Although, like any take on Hanford history, there will be some complexity to this one as well. I am sharing my presentation, correct? I do not see it up, and that is fine if I am. Just want to make sure. Oh, all right, we got sharing. Um, Diana, will you make sure that you have sound enabled as well? Because we do have some clips in here. Awesome. Okay. Hopefully this will all work and we'll be all good to go. So as Anna Grissel said, this presentation here is about holidays at Hanford. It's a lot of Christmas. I couldn't find a lot on Thanksgiving. So we got a lot of Christmas coming up. But it's not too early. I was at Costco recently and they already have all the Christmas stuff, so this fits right in. Um, as Energacell said, I am Assistant Director of the Hanford History Project. We curate for the Department of Energy the Hanford Collection, which is a collection of artifacts and archival material from the Hanford site that documents plutonium production from 1943 to 1990. We manage these collections for the Department of Energy. In addition, we have collected some of our own material from community members, material that the old Crest Museum had. That's an institution that served this contract before WSU and closed down in 2014. And we still take in new donations from individuals who have Hanford objects they'd like store in our collections facility, as well as we participate in new identifying and bringing things off-site when historic artifacts are identified. We do not hold any indigenous or tribal materials. Those are for the DOE's collections. Those are stored at the Wanapum Heritage Center and managed by archaeologists there. The repository is actually behind me. I'm kind of broadcasting from the office today. Um, and it's a 8,000 square foot building here in North Richland. Um, the address is 3251 Porta Benton Boulevard. We are open to the public. I do ask that you contact me before you come by just to make sure I'm here and that we have time to help you, especially if you have a research question. But we're open for research. People that are we're open for donations. We're open and always happy to give short guided tours of some of our collections. But we do ask that any of that is done by appointment or contact us first before dropping by, just to make sure I have time to assist you and can kind of fit that into our schedule. Um, and then lastly, I teach here at the campus. I teach largely U.S. and world history. Um, and I do try to integrate Hanford into definitely a section of the classes I teach. Although teaching large surveys on world and U.S. history, there's a lot to cover there. But I do really enjoy bringing that in for students who know very little about Hanford. Um, and so that's enough about me and kind of my background. Let's get straight to the holidays. So our collections do not have any indigenous native um, uh, archival or artifact materials. I didn't really have anything to choose from, but of course, I want to acknowledge that of course, while this presentation begins with Euro-American settlement, 20th century history, there is a long and rich history, tribal histories that continue on to the present day and into the future, and of course into time immemorial, into the past. Very important places of celebration and of coming together and of resource sharing and all the things we think about holidays. These values that we imbue into modern holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas are of course celebrated and cherished in indigenous communities. However, and that's something I think to acknowledge their enduring presence on the land, their stewardship of the land, the important role that tribal members and tribes play in um, stewarding the land in conversations about cleanup. However, I do not have any material to share it's about indigenous tribes celebrating holidays at the Hanford site. So I do have a little bit to share about the pre-Manhattan Project community. So if we could go to the next slide. This is, like I said, it's a mostly lighthearted holiday history presentation. I picked this picture because it's a presentation in a Quonset hut sometime in the late 1940s, and I figured what better way to start out a presentation than a slide of a presentation. So next slide, please. So, some of the first evidence I could find of holiday celebration in our archives out at the Hanford site is this cover from the 1915 edition of the White Bluff Spokesman, the first newspaper that covered specifically the Hanford White Bluffs area. In 1938, this newspaper moved off the Hanford site and merged with the Kennewick Courier Reporter that then merges with the Pasco Herald and becomes the Tri-City Herald in kind of a roundabout way. But here, this was kind of the earliest celebration in a mostly lighthearted fashion. This of course newspaper wishes people Merry Christmas, lots of advertisements about Merry Christmas, and then a really sad headline in the upper right that kind of punctures through the holiday mood, which is suicides in lonely cabin. So certainly there was some struggles in the dark days of Christmas season 1945. This is the earliest newspaper that exists for this area, um, and really covered the small towns of Hanford and White Bluffs. Richland, the smallest of the three pre-Manhattan Project communities, was covered by was really more orientated towards Pasco and Kennewick. It was small. In 1940, Richland had 240 people, whereas Hanford had around 400, and White Bluffs had about 500. And then there's a number of people that live um, uh, in the kind of in the areas that make up the Hanford site today. A number of people living up by the McGee homestead and Cold Creek. Um, and kind of just spread out, right? This is a very rural area. This is a very dispersed rural settlement. Um, and these towns are important to local history, but kind of quite small. Pasco, even in 1915, kind of dwarfs all of the other towns in the region, mostly because it is a railroad hub, and so it has that kind of infrastructure and connection. But the White Bluff Spokesman at this point was a weekly paper published, I believe, on Fridays, and it kind of it did what a weekly paper would do at this time. It collected important local stories, kind of brought in any important national news, served to advertising, and it really was, would have been one of the most important institutions in a small place like Hanford and White Bluffs. Um, so next slide, please. So this next slide is a clip from Shirley Stewart. It's mostly audio. Some reason when I was making the clip, we couldn't get the video and the audio to sync quite properly. But in this clip, Shirley Stewart, who I interviewed in January of 2020, right before you know what happened. Shirley Stewart grew up in what's known as the McGee homestead. Her father was Chester McGee, who was an early homesteader up in the area kind of west of the 200 area, right by that interchange, the Yakima barricade, where Highway 240 meets the road um, over that you could take over to get up to Yakima, kind of going that back way. The McGee family homesteaded up there, so up on the plateau, not down by the river. And Shirley Stewart she was 92 when I interviewed her and had these amazing memories. And it's a really wonderful oral history. All of our oral histories can be found on our website, which is a simple website. It's hanfordhistory.com. I'll put that in the chat here um, for those that would want to check it out. You can search for all of these. And so in this clip, Shirley talks about, I kind of pulled a clip out of about Christmas. She talked a little bit here about what was special about Christmas to her.
And something I always have remembered, in those days you didn't have oranges or things like that. And the big thing, every year we always had a play at Christmas time for the little school, and we always had Christmas baskets, and they always got oranges. Those kids that could hardly wait to get that orange.
Right.
And now the kids don't think a thing about it.
No,
And a little bit of candy, a candy cane, and I don't remember an apple. I suppose we had apples in them. I don't remember that part, but I do remember they used to go down along the river and get a juniper for Christmas trees for the school.
I love that clip because of just the wonderful simplicity of really not taking for granted kind of what we take for granted today, right? That an orange would be a special treat. And certainly in the 1920s and 30s, it would, right? They don't grow here. It would take quite a bit to get them here. And just that would be this, this kind of simple treat that would really transport you in the cold and dark of Christmas time to where imagining like where that orange is from, right? And kind of feeling the sun. And I love the thought of getting a juniper tree for a Christmas tree, kind of using what they had. There's far fewer trees at this time than there are today. And certain, and so just I love that thought of this kind of, you know, very rural, just very homespun kind of Christmas. And it kind of just filled my heart. Anyway, to the next clip, please. So this is one of the photos that was donated to us from the Hanford White Bluffs Pioneer Association by Frank Bash, who grew up. I believe Frank Bash grew up well, he grew up in one of the three pre-Manhattan Project communities. I don't remember exactly whether it's Richland, White Bluffs, or Hanford, but he was living in Medford, Oregon at this point, having been evicted, removed from the land with everyone in 19 late 1942. The 586 square miles of this region, the Columbia Basin here, was removed from public ownership, and tribes were also removed from the land, or their access was withdrawn when the federal government took the land as part of the Manhattan Project. And so for the communities of Hanford, White Bluffs, and Richland, this meant people had sometimes several weeks, sometimes a little bit more to gather their things, and they had to leave their homes. These evictions started at kind of February, March of 1943. This also meant that like the schools had to compress the school year to graduate kids before they were evicted. And of course, for tribal groups like the Yakima and the Nez Perce and the Wanapum, um, and the Umatilla, that they were barred from accessing traditional cultural properties on the site. Right after, or kind of right even during World War II in 1944, the Hanford White Bluffs Pioneer Association was formed um, by many of these residents that had been evicted, and they started gathering and they started collecting. First started gathering in Prosser, and they started collecting histories of their communities, um, which were now taken away. Right, they had been removed. People had been barred from coming to the land. Um, and in 2016, the granddaughter of one of the gentlemen that started the association donated many of the records of the association to WSU. And so this photo comes, it's undated, but it's of a school class sometime in the 1930s, having a Christmas party. And so this is one of that was the metadata that we got with this photo, was kind of Christmas party at White Bluffs. And so um, this this would have been displayed at one of their Hanford White Bluffs Pioneer Association meetings. And they had these meetings, like I said, from 1944 up until 2005, when really that generation who could really clearly remember those days, those pre-42 days, had really begun to age and pass on. Um, okay, next slide, please.
Okay. Hello.
So this was the last White Bluff. I just kind of wanted to end this pre-Manhattan section with the last White Bluff spokesman that I could find. Um, and these, so here's another, wonderful Merry Christmas um, uh, headline, although a bit busier of a newspaper from 1915. Definitely documenting some interesting world events. Um, we're talking about trade conditions, but also a lot of local news. Um, and like I said, in 1938, this paper would merge with the Kennewick Courier Reporter. If you're ever interested in doing archival research in about these with these pre-Manhattan Project newspapers. All of these White Bluff spokesmen are actually up on a site. They're all digitized by the Library of Congress, and they're all up on a site called Chronicling America. I'll put that in the chat. And Chronicling America has hundreds, maybe probably thousands at this point, of pre-1940 newspapers up on its website from all 50 states and territories, and that you can go through searching. So if you're ever doing, it can be really useful. Obviously, if you're a historian, it's a site that you want to use. But if you are doing genealogical research, it's a really great site. You could be looking for family names and people in the past. Um, and what's really cool is that a lot of it is full text searchable. So you can just type in you can select the paper you want, type in your search terms. And that's really neat. It's a wonderful thing that the Library of Congress does. And best of all, it's getting a new website upgrade. It's the same version it's been now for like 15 years, so they're finally updating the interface, so it'll be a lot easier to search. They said in 2024, so I guess they still have a month and a half left to meet their deadline. But if you know much about what gets funded in the government, the archives and libraries are usually last on the list, so it wouldn't surprise me if it doesn't exactly happen this year, but should be soon. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to move to the Hanford Construction Camp. This camp was began to be built in the late spring, early summer of 1943 to February of 1945. I was corrected by a friend, my friend Don Sorensen, a Hanford historian extraordinaire, that there actually was a 1943 Christmas season program, but there weren't any pictures yet. There wasn't a project photographer then. And there's not much documenting about it, but there was a 43 season. However, there weren't very many people there. Hanford really starts to get going in early 19 to mid 1944 is really when a lot of the construction is really heating up. Um, and to give the sense of what Hanford kind of looks like at this time, I used this quote from Peter Bacon Hales, who wrote a really wonderful book about Hanford when the name of it is totally escaping me right now. Um, oh, and I can't see it on my bookshelf. Anyway, Peter Bacon Hales is the historian, and he had this quote: Hanford was somewhere between an army base and a utopian social experiment. And that's really true when you look at these kind of competing ideas of DuPont, the federal contractor that is running the site, and the Army Corps of Engineers, which is kind of directing a lot of the development. And you see that DuPont is really concerned about worker retention and providing good accommodations for people. The Army Corps of Engineers, um, headed by General Leslie Groves, is really just bare bones. They just want to get the job done and move on. General Groves, oh, sorry, Atomic Spaces. That's the book that Peter Bacon Hales wrote, Atomic Spaces. Really, really interesting book. Highly recommended if it's a bit older, but it's a wonderful book of photography and thinking about the many legacies of the Manhattan Project. If you haven't encountered that book, Hales is an excellent photographer and historian. Um, anyway, Groves was very concerned about just wanted to get the project done as fast as possible, spending as little money as possible. And there's a lot of compromises there. And that's why I love this quote about Peter Bacon Hales, because there's a lot of recognition that that Hanford had to be made livable. Even though there was this temporary community, there's a lot of challenges at Hanford. It's remote. The weather is extreme. It's cold in the winter. It's hot in the summer. It's dusty all the time because there's construction going on all the time. Um, it is largely treeless. It's like I said before, it's remote. It's really challenging for people who had never been to the Pacific Northwest and even and really didn't think that this was the Pacific Northwest. And Hanford had a really high attrition. Hundreds of people left a day. Okay. So let's get into what they did to celebrate. Um, Next slide, please. Oh, I'll add one more. One of my favorite Groves, one of my favorite Groves anecdotes is that they needed to build a hotel in Richland to house people that were coming in and they didn't have housing for them yet. So they needed a hotel to keep them for a couple of days. And what they built is actually today the Hanford House. It's a Holiday Inn Express now. It was a Red Lion before. There's always been a hotel at that spot, but the first hotel they build, Groves says, well, the Army doesn't build hotels. He was very insistent on this. And so what they did is they called it the Richland Transient Quarters because really, technically, what is a hotel but a quarters for transient people? But I just love that's that's the mindset of the man in charge of the Manhattan Project, right? Is getting things his way. So anyway, so here's a cover of the 1944 Sage Sentinel. This was a newspaper for people that lived in the Hanford construction camp. You can see in the top there it says published weekly by HEW Employees Association. That's Hanford Engineer Works, not to be mailed or taken from the area. And so here it talks about the entertainment and all these things. I love that one of the things of concerns is kind of down here at the bottom right. People worried about losing priority for smokes, for cigarettes. Different times, obviously, mid 1940s. Very, very different times. Um, and so Hanford, in whole, a really great way to understand Hanford is that it is it is rushed, and it is a secret project, with of course a major imperative. One of the most important missions of the whole war, and one of the most consequential efforts in modern human history. DuPont and the Army Corps made huge demands of this transient workforce of 50,000 people, that roughly 50,000 that worked on the Hanford site, 46,000 of whom lived at the Hanford construction camp. And in turn, it had to make pretty extraordinary concessions to workers' physical and social needs. Next slide, please. The propaganda of the project, which was conveyed in billboards, flyers, and the Sage Sentinel newspaper, had urged workers to buy war bonds and stay till the project was done. But during the holidays, DuPont had to give back to the workers with holiday merriment. Part of this was to keep turnover in check, as during the average day, hundreds of workers terminated their employment. Every day, hundreds of people walked off the job. Um, okay, next slide, please. The bureaucratic apparatus of DuPont planned this cheer, mirth, and comfort. They had an organizational chart that delegated each aspect of holiday social planning, and careful attendance records from each event were kept to determine the reach, right? Kind of things where this kind of metric gathering we're used to doing today. Events were carefully planned from mid-December to New Year's Eve. Here you can see a little nice, beautiful little sage dressed up as an Xmas tree. Okay, next slide, please. Um, so here you can see kind of Camp Hanford. This was the town, this kind of temporary construction camp overlaid over the old town of Hanford, where roughly 46,000 people lived at its height. Here you can see it kind of all decorated, all right, kind of all gussied up for Christmas. Trying to kind of trying to add a little cheer into what looks like a pretty bleak, dusty landscape, right? A kind of, a landscape not out of place in, a military base, um, a dry old West town. Um, that certainly was a harsh place for folks. I really like this photo because the holiday decorations kind of really look out of place. I don't know how much they do to set a sense of place for Christmas. And it just kind of makes me laugh. Anyway, next slide, please. Activities were separate for white and colored workers, the latter of whom, colored, to use the terminology of the day, were normally treated to simple activities like cards and bingo, while the former, white workers, got more extravagant functions: variety shows, nationally known singers, boxing, wrestling, and basketball, circus acts, dances, and visits from Santa. So we'll see some of these in the next slide. Next slide, next slides. Next slide, please. Um, Black workers did get their own variety shows. There's not a ton of documentation of African American workers during the Manhattan Project. They make up a very small percentage of all of the photos, somewhere around 20 or 30 of all of the photos taken by Robley Johnson, the site photographer. Um, but this is one of a black entertainer performing for what would have been a segregated crowd at the Hanford Auditorium. Next slide, please. One of the variety shows from the University of Idaho, the all-girl orchestra and chorus at the Hanford Auditorium. Um, so that's variety for you. Next slide, please. Here we have some of our nationally known acts. Now, probably not nationally known anymore, but Kay Kaiser was one of the most popular variety show piano playing singer folks in the United States. He starred in many movies in the 1930s and 40s, was played on the radio, and a pretty big draw for a mostly secret construction camp in the middle of Eastern Washington. Uh, so next slide, please. There's folks queuing up outside of the Hanford Auditorium to go see Kay Kaiser. You could imagine this was a humongous draw. Next slide, please. There's the man himself, Mr. Kay Kaiser and his orchestra. Next slide, please. Here is some of the entertainment I mentioned. Like I said, they have boxing shows, wrestling shows, and this is um, one of the basketball tournaments they had. You can see there's a UW player. One of the jerseys, possibly two, is could be a squad from UW playing an exhibition game. And if you look in the background, you can see some Christmas. See a season's greetings there in the center. Um, you can see some of the kind of Christmas decorations here. All right, next slide, please. Some dances with a Lindy orchestra, kind of and I'm not sure if this is I don't know if this is Lindy's actual orchestra or a or who the Lindy dance is named after, um, and or not, but certainly it would have been a huge event, a very well attended dance. Next slide, please. Here's some of the document dancing. You can see the Christmas tree in the background. Looks like possibly part of a variety show, kind of based on the getup, um, on the costumes. I will note too that part of these variety shows, thankfully, um, well, thankfully, not thankfully, um, not photographed as the blackface that almost assuredly would have been at a lot of these variety shows. We do have some documentations of blackface performance in the town of Richland in the 1940s and into the mid 1950s. Um, and that certainly would have been a part of this. Of course, despite the fact that there were perfectly capable colored entertainers at the Hanford Construction Camp, but that was never the point of blackface. It's about power. Um, it's about power and of saying who gets to kind of cast what stereotype upon whom. Next slide, please. Next slide should be a visit from Santa. If I remember my slides. Yeah, so here's the obligatory visit from Santa for the kids, um, who are kind of looking like kids do, little shocked, a little not sure of what to make of the strange person in this getup. Uh, it always seems better for the parents than for the kids anyway. Next slide, please. Robley Johnson, the site photographer, documented homemade nativity scenes, like you can see here. And of course, next slide, please. And Santa and his reindeer-drawn sleigh above a administration building at the Hanford Construction Camp. If any other holidays were celebrated, such as Hanukkah, um, or anything else. It's not found in site documentation. So largely to say that this is almost assuredly all Christian Christmas holidays. Next slide, please. So, oh, this is this is the wonderful decoration put over the women's barracks. Women were about a fifth of the workers at Hanford, so Hanford was mostly, right, four-fifths men. Many of them older men, because of just who was able to draw on the workforce at the time. But the women's barracks really resembled a prison camp. They were guarded with barbed wire. Many women interviewed later on oral histories did report feeling rather unsafe in the presence of so many men. Um, what's interesting about the way that Hanford approached couples, and this is a very general Groves approach, is that it did not house couples together. Men and women, husbands and wives had to live separately in separate barracks, and in fact, husbands would have to come visit their wives in supervised visits by the kind of head of the dormitory block, which is rather amusing to do to married couples. Of course, very fitting with the norms of 1940s America, or not even really fitting, really almost Victorian type of sexual policing. But this is, of course, it's just I love this little attempt to give Christmas cheer to a pretty bleak picture in terms of the way that these women are, of course, being locked up and controlled. Although you could read as being protected for their own safety, but certainly, certainly an interesting picture nonetheless. Next slide, please. The obligatory holiday party. This one at one of the at the typist's office. I chose this picture because for some reason I just really like. There's just something universal about adults uncomfortably sitting on Santa's lap that is as true then as it is today. And the fact that Santa doesn't really look very Santa-ish, and that these people are all posed for this photo, and kind of some forced. I read forced holiday cheer into this, but I came across this photo, and I don't know, something about it really struck me. All right, next slide, please. Oh, I will answer, Sarah Williams. It's a great question. Since we're at the Hanford Construction Camp, Sarah Williams asked, where did parents usually shop for Christmas gifts for their kids at Hanford? They would have done mail order, or there actually was a Sears Roebuck store at Hanford. Either that, or they would have gone shopping at Kennewick, Pasco, or Yakima at some of the stores around there. So there would have been places to get gifts for your loved ones and friends. So there's of course of the Esquire girls at Camp Hanford, a little variety show. Again, really reflecting that the camp is four-fifths men, many of them single men. Certainly some very gendered camp entertainment. I'm not really sure who the Esquire girls are, but there they are. Next slide, please. So, Ralph Sanson here, who was interviewed by the B Reactor Museum Association back in 1992. Ralph Sanson was a Manhattan Project era worker. And he reflects on the need, so the Hanford area, especially this time of year and getting into the winter season, can be very gray and cloudy and foggy, and definitely a morale buster for those laboring in the winter months. Ralph Sampson here mused that this might actually be a security feature.
As a matter of fact, here's a little sidelight that might be interesting. Got here on the 3rd of December, as I said, and it was a dreary, cloudy days like we've had. Are you from this around here? Like we've had from time to time in the winter. And we didn't see the sun until Christmas Day. It came out for a couple of hours and then back again. And the scuttlebutt amongst the peons and everybody was that that was a camouflage that they had put up so that, to hide this. But it was just good old Washington weather. And like I said, from the 3rd of December to the 24th until Christmas Day, I didn't see a peak of the sun.
Oh, that's interesting. The cloud camouflage.
Yeah, that's everybody. Nearly everybody had that as a theory.
All right, next slide, please.
As a matter of fact,
this next slide, Bob Shea, who we interviewed in 2013, fondly remembered the Thanksgiving and Christmas meals that he was served at the Hanford construction camp.
And the mess halls, although they were fantastic. The food was excellent. That served the people, and the mess halls provided, if the guys wanted them, lunches to carry out to their work site, so that they didn't have to prepare them, which would have been pretty tough at the dormitories. But the mess halls served excellent food, and actually the people from the trailer court were welcome anytime they wanted to go to the mess hall. And I think, if I recall correctly, I don't know about the breakfast and lunch, but the dinners were a great big whopping 35 cents a piece per person. And that was everything. That was family style, and you could eat all you wanted. Mom and Dad and brother and I went to, I can remember at least 2 or 3 times going there for Thanksgiving and or Christmas dinners. And excellent food, excellent. I'll tell you a little story there. The one experience, we went, and of course it was family style. It was just benches to sit on and wooden tables. They did, I think, at Thanksgiving and Christmas, they did put a tablecloth on, tablecloth. But the one time we went, the one fellow sitting across from us, obviously living in the barracks or someplace, didn't have his family with him. Anyway, he, during the time that Mom and Dad and my brother and I were sitting there having our dinner, he consumed 5 pies. No meat and potatoes. The only thing he's had beside that was coffee. He ate 5 pies. Now these weren't huge pies, but they were pies. And he just took his time. And that's all he had. That was his dinner. And you could do that. It was family style. You could have all you wanted, and this.
Sometimes you just go for it. You have 5 pies for dinner. Next slide, please. One interesting story about wartime Hanford and the construction workers is that of the Day's Pay fundraiser and the Plain Day's Pay. In 1944, the Hanford HEW Workers Association wanted to raise funds to directly contribute to the war effort. And one of the ideas came from a member of the association who had gotten a letter back from her son, who was flying overseas, that they were losing bombers left and right. And so they said, well, why don't we ask people to contribute a day of their pay to purchase an airplane? And so the Day's Pay fundraiser was born. Incredibly successful fundraiser. The Day's Pay still lives on today. In fact, the Richland Police Department just adopted the Day's Pay plane as their symbol on their police badge. You can see it on the police cars here in town. There's an exhibit about the Day's Pay over at the Pasco Naval Air Museum, where we have artifacts from our collection that are actual artifacts from the plane itself, are all out on display. And one thing that so the Hanford construction workers that contributed to this felt real ownership of the plane, right? They had contributed and bought this plane, and the people that flew it felt a special connection and a real pride that they were flying something that that Americans themselves had purchased, right? That people had given their own money directly to buy this plane. Day Space flew over 60 missions, was damaged but not shot down, but was of course scrapped, like most of our B-17s after the war. I think it was a B-17. Pretty sure it was a B-17. Might be a B-24. One of the bombers. Um, One thing that was interesting is that Hanford construction workers were encouraged to write letters and wanted to write letters to the crew, and the crew wrote letters back. And so this is a Christmas card to Staff Sergeant Perel, who was the ball turret gunner, and his family. He kept these cards as well as the pilot Arliss Weiniger. His son Wyatt kept the cards, and in fact, our artifacts from the plane were donated by Wyatt Weiniger in care of his father. And they kept their Christmas cards and things like that. Um, and so this is really it's kind of a beautiful memento, this kind of connection, right, from the home front to the war front in Europe. Days Bay flew in Europe, flew missions over Germany in 1944, 1945. Um, and so you can see here down at the bottom, right, it's signed Hanford. So this is a letter from someone at the construction camp to Staff Sergeant Purell. Next um, slide, please. There's a couple of these really awesome cards. Again, another one. This one from Lucille to Sergeant Perel again, December 1944. And I just there's a real, war is terrible, but there's a real humanity in this kind of connection from home front to battlefront, this kind of connection from people to the plane, and this real kind of, this real outpouring of kind of interest and care, that's really going both ways. The fact that these people sent these cards, and the fact that Burrell and Weininger saved these as mementos to pass down to their children and eventually to donate them into the archive. Next slide, please. While the Hanford construction camp, that city of 50,000, housed those that built Hanford, the more permanent community took over the reformatted town of Richland, turning it from a sleepy village of 247 to over 21,000 in 1950. This all-American city had the highest birth rate in the nation per capita in 1950 as well. Think of it, a community of mostly young people and small children, no one with family in the area. And in this time, community celebrations took on a special importance as morale builders as well. The following pictures show off some of that community spirit. There's a holiday party 1950. The next slide. Here's some firemen repairing toys for children. Next slide. Many Hanford attracted young families, but also employed General Electric. After World War II and GE takes over in 1947, they employ a lot of people straight out of college, young men and women, and build dormitories. And these dormitories were real. Had a lot of social events to kind of keep, not to connect young couples, but also to kind of keep, kind of serve some of the same purpose as wartime Hanford, to keep morale up. And so this is one of the parties at one of the dorms in Richland. Next slide, please. Again, young woman painting windows in one of the dormitories, kind of giving some holiday cheer. Next slide, please. Party in a North Richland construction camp in the file room. North Richland was a smaller construction camp, but helped house those mostly construction workers that did the Cold War expansion of Hanford. That's the C and DR reactors, H, K East, K West, and the Redox and Purex facilities. And that North Richland construction camp was hastily constructed, and it used a lot of World War II infrastructure like this Quonset hut. There are a lot of Quonset huts in North Richland. Next slide, please. Oh, of course, some scout parents getting ready to hang up Christmas signs around the town of Richland. Next slide, please. And this was in the John Ball School, which was a school made out of Quonset hut buildings joined together. Again, a kind of an army surplus school. And this is a little holiday celebration. And again, you can see the Quonset hut here. Pretty typical infrastructure in the early 1950s. Next slide, please. So here, Leonard, so kids at the time remember Richland fondly, almost mythically, as Leonard Peters does here in this clip, our last clip.
Yeah, what we'd do in the wintertime when the roads were snowy and icy, you'd hide behind a bush, and if a car went by, you ran out and grabbed the bumper and have them drag you around. And that was a lot of fun. That was one of the winter sports. But it was kind of interesting. I can remember newspaper front page. It showed a bus with a glove on it. And the story was a hooky bobber, and his hand was wet and it froze to the bumper. And make a long story short, it was on the dangers of hooky bobbing. And but it just happens that the guy that glove belonged to graduated a couple years ahead of me. Name was Jim Crum, who is now an attorney for the U.S. government. But no, it was a fun time. I mean, it was a good time to grow up because wintertime, of course, we had Christmas tree forts. And if there was snow on the ground, we'd have snow forts and choose up sides and have snowball fights hiding behind our snow forts. We would... if there was no snow, or even if there was snow after Christmas, we'd build Christmas tree forts, stack them up, and have a roof on it, and even sleep out in it. But if neighbor down the street, if they had Christmas tree fort, about 1 or 2 in the morning, we'd sneak down and steal all their trees. And we'd have a bigger fort then.
All right, next slide, please. Now, I want to take a little bit of a hard turn and puncture this kind of bucolic American graffiti bubble a little bit. I was given this image many years ago by the historian Michelle Gerber, and I've had it on my office on the wall for a long time, always as a reminder to me, and always thinking that somewhere, sometime, I would address this, and it would come in really handy. And it seems like the perfect time. This image, it comes from an art show and a show for downwinders, and also photographs and artworks, expressions from a nuclear age, Jim Acord and others, an exhibit referencing the infamous Green Run. It's well known, of course, that Hanford from 1945 onward released excessive, large, and even in some cases, especially with today's um, with today's standards, unconscionable amounts of airborne radiation, specifically or especially in the early years of its operation, 1945 to 1950, before the processing canyons had efficient stack filters on them. Even then, there was still some radiological contamination, but the years 1945 and 1946 were especially egregious. And of course, this is along with radiation discharged into the river, and of course, on the ground, and the radiation and chemical contaminants we store in the tanks. The most notorious of this event was the Green Run in December, early December of 1949, when when Hanford specifically released it, or relaxed its standards, and burned what was then known as what's known as green fuel that had not aged properly, to measure that, to measure the airborne emissions of that, to then get a baseline of data for what radiation would be released from processing green fuel, so that we could monitor what the Soviets were doing. So we put people in the surrounding areas, expose them to about this says 20,000. It's actually about 11,900 curies of radioiodine, and some other curies of radioxenon, and as people in the surrounding areas were especially affected because this was done. This fuel was processed when there was a temperature inversion, one of those gray, cloudy days where the clouds hang, and so instead of dispersing into the atmosphere and spreading out that contamination, it was concentrated over the Hanford site. And over the surrounding communities, and even parts of eastern Washington and central Oregon. A very infamous event, well covered, but of course occurring during the holiday season. And that innocence of Christmas is of course invoked. The innocence and wonder of Christmas is of course invoked in this poster, about this tragic incident, um, where the United States ran an experiment that of course was, violated its own standards and ethics, and experimented with with uninformed United States, with uninformed people around the area of experiment. Next slide, please. This is a map of the Green Run, the area of exposure. I will note that, while readings were measured as far as Kettle Falls, Spokane, the Dalles, and Pendleton, that big loop down to Klamath actually is some mostly false. That data. This graph was generated on data that was, that big southern area was, of the result of a contaminated car, that where they were doing the measurements and they were getting out of the car measuring, saying, "Oh, we're finding radiation here," driving further south, and they realized it in Klamath Falls that they weren't measuring contamination in the air down there or on the vegetation. It was the vehicle they were driving, and the instruments they had were gunked up. But that was not communicated to the people that made this graph, to the people that wrote the report. So they put this in there. It's interesting foible. Um, Sad foible. Okay, moving on. I think my last couple slides here. So moving back, I didn't want to forget about Thanksgiving, and I want to just end with the three Thanksgiving slides that I found. So, and these go in kind of progression. So here we have turkeys, and then next slide. We have chefs and many of those same turkeys, and then next slide. And we have Thanksgiving dinner. So there's from soup to nuts, a Hanford Thanksgiving in 3 slides. Next slide, please. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for sitting and listening and learning, and I appreciated the chance to talk Christmas and holidays with everybody, and of course, happy holidays.
Thank you so, so much, Robert. You are amazing. And this was great. Lots of learning for me tonight, definitely. I did want to ask a question about Thanksgiving. So, do you think mostly workers would stay on site for the festivities? And the photos we saw were obviously at Camp Hanford, and that meal was provided for the workers. So can you tell us just a little bit more about those?
Sure. So yeah. So the mess halls would have supplied a full Thanksgiving family style spread. They would have pulled out all the, and that would have fed folks in the barracks, and as Don Lewis mentioned, the people living in the trailer camp. Hanford had the largest trailer camp in the world at the time, over almost 7,000 trailers, parked at the Hanford construction camp. So yeah, most people ate at the barracks because it was cheap and it was all you could eat, and it was Hanford had first priority or top priority for foods. So a lot of people in the United States, everyone is under rationing at this time, gas rationing, liquor rationing, and of course a lot of rationing of meat and staples. The mess halls weren't subject to rationing. They actually got first pick of food. So they had ice cream machines, they had full Christmas roasts. Hanford was brewing, had a contract for beer out of Walla Walla. They had everything, right? They had the good stuff. Like it was the only restaurant in town, but also it was the best restaurant in town. So people would have done that because they're also just, for most people there was no space. Now people living in Richland in the surrounding communities, they would have had their own Thanksgivings. They wouldn't have gone to the mess halls. But for the roughly 50,000 people out on site, yeah, they would have eaten at the mess halls.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And with that question, I am going to ask my co-host Ben to see if he has any questions, and then we will just start asking the questions from the public. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, again, Robert, thank you so much for
No
spending the
problem.
evening with us and talking about our all the merrymaking happening at Hanford. If I wanted to thank everyone online for submitting such great questions. If you're still on Facebook or Zoom, feel free to add your questions in the chat so we can keep those going in, keep those coming in. One question I saw, this came up early on when you were talking about kind of the Hanford history, but what is the best way to learn about tribal holidays in the area pre-Hanford?
Well, you would want to contact go to the tribal museums themselves. So one of them, Heritage Center, Yakima Cultural Center, Temuscalit Institute for the Umatilla. They would be the ones that have those. That go straight to the source. And if you haven't been to those places, definitely go visit them. Those are three very wonderful cultural heritage institutions. And there's also the Nez Perce National Historical Park. So for our four area tribes that are involved in Hanford cleanup, that's the Nez Perce, Walla Walla, Yakima Nation, and Confederate Tribes of Umatilla. They each have these wonderful cultural heritage institutions that need your support.
Fantastic. Those are amazing resources. So thank you for sharing those. I had a question. I'm going to take a moment away from the chat. A question regarding kind of the archives as well as recipes. I was wondering if some of the archives that you ever get donated to you are recipes or maybe holiday themed recipes that people may have had back during that time. Any chances there's a connection there?
We have a couple books that like churches put together of like old-timey recipes. I don't tend to keep though a lot of that because it's not really specific to Hanford. Um, One of the most interesting resources, if you're interested in like what were people eating back then, is go look at extension bulletins. So state universities like that run extension services like WSU and other state colleges have extension bulletins. Many of these are online. WSU's are at the what's called the MASC, the MASC, the Manuscripts Archive Special Collections. And they would publish all kinds of great recipes for people, especially the most interesting ones are during the Depression and the war, where they're like ration recipes, and they're like, hey, here's how you can make this thing you like with the ingredients you have. One of my favorite stories of revolving that is, carrot cake is a rationing recipe. We love, carrot cake's this kind of unctuous thing now, but it was done to use carrots and like stretch flour and sugar and find some way to like use, and that's certainly a recipe of its time. But that would be where I would go, because by and large, people didn't really donate like grandma's recipe book. But if you're interested in like what did old recipes at the time look like, those we do have a couple old like church books, but those are in their collections of recipes from all over. Churches usually sold them as like fundraisers, but those old extension bulletins from the 30s and 40s, those things are gold mines of just really interesting like slices of history.
Amazing. Yeah, thinking about those pictures of turkeys that you shared, I was like, those wouldn't stand up for a regular sized turkey nowadays,
Oh no.
being
No.
how they're bred the way that they are. Moving on to our next question, Maya Burke had a really good one regarding the white activities and the colored
Oh
activity.
yeah. Yep.
And I noticed this as well, but Maya noticed that the Christmas schedule had a declassified stamp on it. Her question is, was it originally classified, and if so, any idea why? Additionally to that, were workers' families allowed to attend?
So, three questions. Yes, was originally classified. Why? Because it comes from the DuPont report that it issued to the government when it fulfilled its contract. You can find this report on DOE Reading Room, or I have a copy too. It's huge. It's like 1,600 pages. It's basically the DuPont's like, hey, we did the contract. Here's the report of all the work we did. it's completing the contract, and it was initially classified because it had a lot of stuff about like locations and activities. This was done in 1946, right? So tons of Bourne classified stuff in it, and then it was declassified in the 1980s. I think it was I think it was earlier. I think it was maybe the 1960s or 1980s, but then it was declassified. But they have to go through in every page where if there was the word classified, they have to stamp declassified on it. And so yes, that was part of a classified report. Workers' families, if workers had their families, and that's most of the folks in the trailer camps, for those that had to bring their families, they generally lived in an automobile trailer with their family, and so yes, and they would have been allowed to attend. In fact, you saw all that stuff for kids, right? There were Santa with kids, and so there were many children. There was a school out at the Hanford site for school-age children, so there were children and family members there. And yeah, they would have been allowed to attend age-appropriate events.
Excellent. Yes. Maya, thank you for that question. Great questions. Next one, just moving down the line, at least in our Zoom chat. Would workers be more interested in decorating for their own sakes or project managers to raise morale? This is from Sarah Williams. I guess that's kind of thinking of how we are in an office setting sometimes, and it's like, okay, here come the holidays, and let's put up our decorations. Was it driven? Could you tell which way it was driven by?
It's absolutely both. It is definitely DuPont is incredibly concerned about morale. They're trying to stem termination. One of the things that they say around here, right, is that the winds were so bad, so dusty that when they would blow, they were called termination winds because when they would blow the next day, you'd have people lined up at the office to collect their last paycheck, because they were leaving. But so yeah, people did want to do it to bring cheer. Like that nativity scene that there was a picture of, that was hand done. That wasn't done by DuPont. That was somebody did that on their own. But a mix, like in offices today, right? Some people are bitten by the holiday bug, and you know who you are in your office. If that's you, you're the person with the decorated Halloween door, like, you know, beginning of October, and there's some people that are kind of curmudgeonly. But DuPont definitely wanted people to be distracted from the rigors, and the isolation. And, thinking about Hanford, at a munitions factory or a bomber factory, right, a shipbuilding factory, you know what you're making. At Hanford, you know you're doing something important, but very, very few people knew. And so that kind of morale, they're also fighting against this kind of like general malaise or kind of like sense of hope, not total hopelessness, but just engagement, right? We're like, what are we doing? And so these things were really hopeful. You could see they really pulled out like all the stops to make this a very attractive holiday time.
In addition to that, I had a question. What's the archives like in terms of maybe during the Cold War construction in terms of, not necessarily building, the bomb, in that age, but holidays, when it was, a Department of Energy site, was it still kind of um, is there a continuation of these types of photos or stories
So
after World War II?
So things get more decentralized over time. By the time we get to DOE, that's late 70s, things are super decentralized. But there's this important era from 43 to 58 where Richland is ran by the government contractor. It's initially DuPont, which builds Richland, and then GE comes in 47 when they sign the Atomic Energy Act and expands big time. And Hanford expands and Richland expands during the GE years when Richland is not privatized, when it is a public, it's a government town. Yes, there are hundreds of photos I just didn't show that are from those years of 19 like 48 49 to 19 to the mid to late 50s. So many photos created during that time where and I showed some of them. A lot of those 1950 photos are all from that era, um, where it is still a company town, right? The company is the U.S. government, and the product they're making is plutonium. but it's a company town and it's controlled in a company town, with the exception that like people are citizens and it's not a for-profit company and there's a level of openness. But certainly in those years, yes. After 58, when things get privatized, and especially after 1965 is when Hanford makes its first big shift, and that's when the U.S. government, the Atomic Energy Commission, goes from the single model of Hanford contractor to this diversified alphabet soup of Hanford contractors we have today. So that's when you get multiple folks like Westinghouse, Douglas United Nuclear, Dunn, Arco, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and like today, right? We have HMS and CPC Co. and then a bunch of contractor below them. So after 65, that cohesion really and Hanford begins to diversify with groups like TRICNIC, Tri-Cities Nuclear Industrial Council, now TRIDEC really push for Hanford diversification. But that 15 years, 43 to 58, yes, it is very much that weird suburban company atomic utopia thing going on. Where there's that kind of heavy hand of corporate governmental paternalism.
Well, thank you for that insight. Continuing on that line, I know I'm skipping through some of the questions here, and I see Sarah's ones about, what musicians and sports players knew about coming to Hanford. I'll get to
Not a
that
lot.
in a moment. But the question that just came in from Maya Burke was similar to, the topic that we're on. The question they have are, do you know how Leslie Groves felt about these holiday activities? He seems like such a no-nonsense figure. Did he see it as superfluous or a waste of time, or did he value keeping these workers content in order to prevent them from leaving Hanford?
Two words: begrudging acceptance. Groves, DuPont always had Groves kind of bent over a table, like with his back against a corner, because Groves DuPont had not asked the U.S. government to do this. The U.S. government had asked DuPont to do this. In fact, DuPont makes the U.S. government sign this memorandum of understanding, which is really unique in contracting history, that basically forces the government to hold DuPont harmless if this doesn't work, to admit that all the research is theoretical, and to admit publicly that the government basically is begging DuPont, and DuPont initially turns them down. So DuPont has all this leverage to do things their way. And Groves, of course, wants things done his way, but they compromise on tons of things. Grove says, look, for the town of Richland, we're just building barracks. And DuPont says, look, our Wilmington middle and upper managers, they don't live in barracks with their families, General Groves. They live in houses. And they live in as nice of houses as we can build for them. So that's where you get all that, like that Gold Coast National Historic District in Richland. That's all the doctors and lawyers and upper management. But that's DuPont being like, look, even the engineers, like they have families and you kind of need to live in real houses. Nothing super fancy. And the alphabet houses in Richland are they're an architectural style called minimal traditional, but they're nice. They're well built. They're attractive. They're very suburban. They really are the predecessor of like the Levitt towns of the world, the post-war suburbia. But same with the holiday stuff. DuPont said, we got to do these things. We got to spend this money. Like we have to do this for morale. And Groves is kind of like, he doesn't want to, but he does. And you see this in the Oppenheimer movie. You see this in Los Alamos, right? He's always kind of making these, he has reservations about Robert Oppenheimer, but he keeps him close, right? And he befriends, so Groves is always kind of compromising himself. But yeah, he didn't love it. He built a hotel, but he called it a transient quarters. We have the stationery. And that stationery says Richland Transient Quarters on it, right? Because he was going to have his way, in whatever way he could. That's a great question, Maya.
The next question we had was going back to kind of musicians, sports players, entertainment. Um, would they have been 100% truthful with visitors, such as musicians, Kai Kaiser, the bands, all things like that, about what they do at Hanford, or maybe why they're driving out, from Spokane or from Seattle in order to go to this small town? What was kind of the secrecy behind those sorts of gigs or those appearances?
They knew that they were coming to a wartime plant, and that was it. Right? They're just going to Hanford to entertain people at this war project. And that was it. Like that's all that they would tell them. There's a really interesting story about Kai Kaiser. So he is a big figure. He's doing this nationwide tour, and a couple days before he gets to Hanford, he mentions on the radio that he's going to Hanford in Eastern Washington to entertain some people, and he doesn't know what they're doing there. And the FBI gets wind of this, and they're pissed. They are so mad that on national TV he has talked about, or national radio, he's talked about Hanford. And so they actually hold up his piano when he leaves, and he actually loses it in freight. His famous like baby grand, and that piano is actually still in Richland. It's at the Richland High School. So that yeah, they like when he got to Pasco, they grilled him. They were like, "Why'd you do this? You know, you shouldn't have said anything about Hanford." Um, and so yeah, no, they didn't tell him much. They just knew, again, secret wartime project. That's good. Don't ask any more questions. Um,
Well, I mean, as long as the check's green, it's keep 'em coming. Um,
Uncle Sam says jump, right? And it's from 1944. You'd say how high?
There we are. Yeah. There was one last question I was going to save for the end. A question I had was you mentioned the last White Bluff spokesman was that Merry Christmas edition. And I was just curious what happened to the White Bluff spokesman after that edition. Like kind
Oh,
of,
it moved over to the office moved to Kennewick, and it merged with the Kennewick Courier Reporter, and then that merges at some point with Pasco Herald to become Tri-City Herald.
gotcha.
Um,
Okay. Thanks,
Sometime
Rob.
in the late 40s, there's a union strike at Tri-City Herald, and then we have two newspapers again, but then it works itself out. And Glenn Lee was a famous anti-union guy. Um, if you're interested in newspaper union wars, Tiger by the Tail is the book. It's actually a pretty good book. I have one here somewhere. It's in the other room, but it's a pretty fun book.
It's in
Got a
Robert's
lot of
library.
interesting
Of
like
course, it's in Robert's
Tri-Cities
library.
scuttlebutt from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s.
Gotcha. Gotcha. The last question, I think was related, kind of a final plug for you, Robert, but are these old photographs available on HanfordHistory.com? Is there another resource you would recommend for old history
A
photos
lot
like
of
this?
them are. A lot of them are. Yes. Not all, but a lot of them are. We're trying to get more up all the time. But it's, I'm a staff of one in volunteers and interns, although we just hired a curator. They just signed their offer letter. They'll be here next month, so we'll be a staff of two, which will help. It's amazing what one more. I'm 40% time on the project, so be amazing what a full-time person can bring to us. Some of the other photos you can find at the DOE's reading room, their online portal. Some of them you can't. So many years ago, the PNNL had what was called the DDRS, the Declassified Document Retrieval Service, that had all of these photos up. And it was determined it had a bunch of like back-end security vulnerabilities, which is bad if you're PNNL, right? To have like back-end security. And they decided they were going to take it down until they fixed it. Well, um, haven't typical government fashion. They haven't fixed it yet. Largely security reasons, right? They don't want to put up another public facing um, kind of like searchable archive. So a lot of the photos I got from that, the Crest Museum did a scrape of that database years ago, and we have that in our collections. I can I can offer them to people, but I don't have any like they're all public domain, but the versions I have are old scans, but they're there. I haven't put them online because they just because I didn't really want to get involved, but they have them. I know like you guys at ECY have a bunch of them too. They're kind of floating around. They're just not hosted anywhere yet because really like the DOE should pay for that because it's all their stuff, or they should turn it over to the National Archives. So, but someday, but I can provide access to those if you're curious. It's tons. It's like 50,000 photos or something. It's a giant collection.
Wow.
Photos. Yeah, it's tons. A lot of them are, there's all different kinds of things. Some of it's really boring, but some of them are really, really interesting. And they document the site and the Richland up through the kind of the GE through that GE single contractor era.
Interesting.
But yes, please search hanfordhistory.com.
Well, with that, we'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight's event, watching, asking questions. This event was recorded and will be up shortly on both the Ecology Facebook page as well as the Ecology YouTube channel. We'll also have a recording link on our website. And with that, I'll pass it over to Anna for any final thoughts.
Yeah, I wanted to ask maybe if Ryan had a question. This might be a good time to ask it, Ryan.
Oh no, I think all my questions got answered listening to the dialogue. Thanks, though, on your side.
Perfect. Okay, well, I only wanted to say thank you to Robert. It was a pleasure to have you here one more time. I would like to encourage attendees to reach out with us with any other questions they might have and to stay tuned for future events. Like I said at the beginning, we do those if people are interested, and even better, if people have any suggestions of what they want to see, that would be great for us too. I want to thank Robert once more for joining us today with such wonderful information. And I want to ask Robert if he has any final thoughts himself.
No, I want to thank you again for the opportunity. I did want to say that I'm working on an exhibit with the National Park Service and the Reach Museum, based off of the work of a really great intern who's also a doctoral student here at WSU. We're working on an exhibit on Latinos and the Manhattan Project. And so that's going to be coming up at the Reach sometime in the spring. And I also wanted to sow the seed that might be a great future Let's Talk About Hanford series for those that can't make the see the exhibit themselves. I have the contact information for the person, Drew Gamboa, and it would be a really great opportunity for him, and also to share these really valuable stories of all the contributions that the different groups have made to the Manhattan Project.